Today's portion of the Gospel of John describes how that glimpse of the Father's face made the first of his disciples decide that they wanted to follow Jesus. John the Baptist described his role as being the one who would point out the way to the Messiah who would come after him, and the one who would surpass him in every other way. And it was John who physically pointed out Jesus to two guys who were in the crowd that were hanging around him. And they heard him say, "That's him. That's the one I've been talking about." And intrigued, two of those disciples follow along. They start to tag after Jesus. And Jesus becomes aware of them whispering behind him, and he turns around to confront them. "What do you want?" he says. Or maybe the NIV translation is more appropriate here. "What do you seek?" That's a deep question. And maybe not one the guys had a ready answer for at that moment. Did they seek the meaning of life or the solution to end all war and achieve world peace? Put on the spot to come up with a profound answer and to be found wanting, they just settled on a rather lame, "Well, where are you staying?" Jesus sighed, I expect, and said, "Whatever, come along, come and see, try to keep up." So they scrambled to follow him home. The text suggests that Jesus was staying in Bethany across the River Jordan. I imagine that he was staying with his friends Mary and Martha and Lazarus. I wonder what Martha made of having him bring home uninvited guests for dinner. Those hours in Jesus' company made an impression. At least on Andrew. We never heard about the other fellow, but Andrew, he goes home and he finds his brother Peter and brings him back to see. And Jesus sees through Peter from that first glance and promptly names him Cephas, which means rock in Aramaic. In Greek, we get Petros, which we anglicized Peter, or to Pierre in French, which keeps the meaning of rock more obviously than it does in English. And was Jesus intuiting that Peter would someday be the foundational leader of the Christian church? Or was he quick to figure out that Peter had a hard head and could be immovable in his stubbornness? Whichever it was, Peter had the sense of having been really seen, and it changed his life. From then on, it was like a refer a friend campaign. Peter told Philip, Philip told Nathaniel, and so on and so on and so on. Now, when Nathaniel was dubious as to whether anything noteworthy or anything that you could imagine could be good coming from his hometown, his backwater turf, Philip simply said, "You've got to come and see. You got to meet this guy." And when he did, he was bowled over by Jesus' perception of him. And he was in from that moment on. Well, what is it that we learn from this passage? First, that people need to see for themselves, I guess. They might trust a friend's assessment of a person, but more often than not, they want to be the final judge. Another disciple, Thomas, would famously later insist that seeing was believing. And I think we're all a little bit more like Thomas than we might like to admit. Next, I think we can agree that there is an undeniable power in someone giving you their full attention, if only for a few moments. And Jesus could do that. He could see deeply into a person and then follow up by asking the only question that mattered. When Jesus asked Andrew and his friends what they were seeking, they didn't have a ready answer. What did they expect to find if they didn't know what they were looking for, he seems to imply. And it reminds me of the Cheshire Cat in Lewis Carroll's story, Alice in Wonderland. When Alice asks the cat if he can help her with giving her some directions, he responds by asking where she's going. And she responds that she doesn't quite know yet. Well, the cat then observes that it hardly matters what directions anyone might provide. So he suggests that Alice might as well stick around to see what she will see and perhaps learn what it is that she is looking for. Responding to the invitation to stick around and see required of the disciples a willingness to invest a bit of time and an openness to engage in something that might be disturbingly new. When Nathanael didn't buy Philip's claim that he'd come across someone just down the street who had fulfilled both the teachings of Moses and the foretelling of the prophets, it wasn't surprising. If you're from a hick town, you tend to make a big deal of anybody remotely famous who comes from there. I know Chippewa is terribly proud of their homeboy Titanic director James Cameron, and that St. Catharines claims the NHL goalie Jerry Cheevers is their own. But I had to look up who was famous from Fort Erie, and I was astonished to realize that James L. Kraft, the first guy to patent processed cheese and the father of Kraft Dinner, grew up in Stevensville, now officially part of Fort Erie. How did I not know this? My point is that Nathanael couldn't think of anyone from Nazareth's past that might have made him hopeful that another great leader had sprung up from that fertile patch. He's almost offended that anybody worth their salt would ever admit that they had come from Nazareth. It seems to me the same kind of offense that people took when confronted with the idea that God would ever have stooped to take on human form. As the gospel progresses, Come and See stands as an invitation to the Jewish community to put aside old prejudices and test the claims of Jesus and the Christian movement fairly on the basis of personal experience. See what Jesus is doing and decide for yourself. They're invited to meet Jesus, to truly see him, and through him, to see the face of their God. The final thing I hope we take from this passage today is that we're all called to simply bring people to Jesus. We don't have the responsibility to save them. We just simply lead them to salvation by inviting them to come and see what Jesus is all about. Now, your witness is made credible from the very beginning because the person you are inviting is likely somebody you know. They trust you. And if you say that Jesus is good, even if they are initially skeptical, they may trust your conviction enough to allow themselves to come and see. And that's all it takes. Just an invitation. Or, for some tough nuts out there, a persistent invitation to come and see what you see. To come with you to see and be seen by Jesus. And he'll do the rest. And that's good news indeed. Thanks be to God.